And in this panel discussion, we have professors of philosophy, literature, great texts, all coming together to look at Lewis's vision through the space trilogy. The space trilogy has come up again and again in this conference, and I hope that that has the result that more people read it. And so what we're going to have here is a really neat situation where each one of these scholars is going to take one of the books in the trilogy in order and deliver some thoughts on that, and then throw it open to Q&A. Without any further ado, Dr. Weaver.
Thank you, Trent. Prefatory remark, my wife shared some advice, some professional advice about public speaking. She forwarded an email, and it had some axioms of public speaking, and one of those was never give a public talk between the hours of 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the afternoon. This has something to do with our circadian rhythms of sleep. And then the authors of this article go on to say that if you must give a public presentation between the hours of 2 and 4, never follow Alan Jacobs and David Jeffrey. It is a pleasure to follow and, well, to speak in the company of these figures and my colleagues Doug Henry and Scott Moore. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Trent and Frank, for this opportunity. I'd like to open this roundtable discussion with a passage from Out of the Silent Planet. It's a passage I use often to introduce works of science fiction in my great text courses. You might be thinking, how often could you possibly be teaching science fiction in your great text program? Well, quite often, in fact. In the ancient course, there's the Odyssey. In the medieval course, there is Dante's Paradiso. In the early modern course, Thomas More's Utopia. And in the modern world, Swift's Gulliver's Travels and Voltaire's Candide. These are not, of course, science fiction, sci-fi, or even SF, but they do represent some literary sources of science fiction. And I think the best science fiction exhibits some characteristics common to these classics of the Western canon. In Out of the Silent Planet, you may recall, the college professor Elwin Ransom has been kidnapped and taken to Mars, or Malacandra, as the planet is called by its inhabitants. He escapes his captors and finds sanctuary among the native species, who turn out to be intelligent. He becomes fluent in their language, and he meets 3 species of intelligent life on the planet: the towering and austere Sorns, the gregarious Harassa, and the industrious Fifiltrigi. Late in the novel, Ransom is at a sacred assembly of Malacandra, and he encounters yet another alien species. 2 specimens are marched into the assembly under arrest, and Ransom describes them as they come into view. And if you've read some of the text I mentioned above, you might recognize the alien form he represents here. And I quote, the light was behind them as they entered between the 2 farthest monoliths. They were much shorter than any animal he had yet seen on Malacandra, and he gathered that they were bipeds, though the lower limbs were so thick and sausage-like that he hesitated to call them legs. The bodies were a little narrower at the top than at the bottom, so as to be very slightly pear-shaped, and the heads were neither round like those of Harassa, nor long like those of Sorns, but almost square. They stumped along on narrow, heavy-looking feet, which they seemed to press into the ground with unnecessary violence. And now their faces were becoming visible as masses of lumped and puckered flesh of variegated color, fringed in some bristly, dark substance. Suddenly, with an indescribable change of feeling, he realized that he was looking at men. The 2 prisoners were Weston and Devine, and he, Ransom, for one privileged moment, was looking at them with almost Malacandrian eyes. This little vignette illustrates what it is that science fiction does and why it is that we read science fiction. Science fiction allows us to immerse ourselves in a different world, a different landscape, different culture, a different order, so that we might discover anew what it is to be human. In various ways, this same scene is replayed over and over again in sci-fi. I believe Lewis lifts it straight from one of the classics I mentioned earlier. Do you recognize it? It's from Gulliver's Travels. It's Gulliver in Book 4 after his stay with the horsey people, the Wenhams, and his failure to recognize humans on his return to human civilization. But where Gulliver's misrecognition of the human form stems from his suddenly contracted misanthropy, Ransom's misrecognition is a sign of his growth as a human being. For Ransom has come a long way since his kidnapping, and a parallel scene of misrecognition at the beginning of the novel can help us measure how far he has come. Excuse me. For reasons of time, I have to condense a beautifully written episode of several pages, but hopefully this will be enough to evoke your memories of this enchanting scene. Early in the novel, Ransom persistently, doggedly calls the Earth, seen from the window of his spaceship, the moon. Not having ever seen the Earth from outer space, and not being fully aware of where he is, he ignores all the evidence and sees in the full Earth outside the window a larger and brighter moon. By leading with the familiar and the name moon, Ransom represses the truth and the discovery of what is right, and he represses the discovery of what is right in front of him. He assimilates his uncanny experience into what is familiar and known. How far he has come by the time of the Malacandrian assembly. There is, in this late scene that I read earlier, not just a misrecognition of the human form, but a hesitancy to name the creatures before him men. And it is a mark of Ransom's maturity that the naming, the discovery or rediscovery of this word, man, follows so much description and comparison. He is far more receptive to what is right in front of him, seeing a familiar form with new eyes. When he says their legs were like sausages or their bodies were like pears, he is not taking an objective view. He is drawing comparisons. He's writing poetry. This is not assimilating what is foreign to what you know. It is accommodating what is right there in front of you, however familiar or not, accommodating it into a fuller experience, a fuller imagination of the world. In this growth of Ransom from assimilating to accommodating, Lewis gives an inspired vision for the possibilities of the science fiction novel. It is deeply informed by his understanding of philology, the study of language, the study of words. For something like this happens when we study a language. We begin with the primitive and reductive experience of Ransom looking at the full Earth from outer space and calling it the moon. We assimilate the foreign to what we know. We translate words literally, we rely heavily on dictionaries, bilingual dictionaries, and we persist in translating idioms literally and trying to make our own idioms work in the foreign language. But that is elementary. At a certain point, assimilation has to stop and something else happens. If we hope at all to make progress in a language, we have to entertain other ways of doing and saying things. We have to start thinking in a language, and even, as I believe Lewis reported doing, dreaming in a language, a foreign language. Then we, like Ransom, are transformed, and we can see the world with almost Malacandrian eyes. Ransom is a kind of philologist when he is kidnapped at the beginning of the novel, but he becomes a better philologist by the end of the novel. Out of the Silent Planet is a reclamation of philology at its best, at its most human. But that is a story for another session.
Within Paralandra, second of the trilogy's novels, we find some of Lewis's most theologically probing and imaginatively refined work. The poetics that Dr. Weaver has just described attain, I think, their highest expression in this book out of the three. In it, the protagonist, Elwyn Ransom, accepts angelic transportation from drab, gray, cold England, kind of like Waco today, to the color-saturated resplendence and hothouse warmth of Venus, that is, Paralandra. After eons-long ministrations of the planet's archangel, Paralandra now approaches a coming of age when its lord and lady, two anthropoi akin to Adam and Eve, will receive rule over the planet. Ransom arrives, uncertain of his purpose, but he revels in what he finds. Paralandra's lush landscape bursts with aphrodisiacal pleasure, its sweet waters nurse, its verdant lands caress, its undulating ocean soothe, its exotic fruits delight, its comely animals nuzzle. Ransom finds an unspoiled Edenic paradise. He also soon discovers that Paralandra faces perils, in fact. Although plenty of other themes might merit attention, I want in my time to identify one particular of the perils among the many traced in the book. It's a peril rooted in the nature of erotic desire and human longing. Ransom arrives on Paralandra full of disordered desires not yet seen in the planet's history. Lewis pushes us into the thorny thicket comprising the relationship between desire, pleasure, the good, and the will. Hereby, Lewis weaves setting and plot together fabulously well. For where else more appropriately than in the realm of Aphrodite and the planet Venus, under the aegis of the love goddess herself, should a man learn the sweet heartache of desire, the alluring tang of temptation, or the contented pleasure of well-ordered love? Ransom experiences surprise as he discovers the unsoundness of his moral habits and their unfitness for the place he has arrived at. Although a man of advanced education and refined tastes, he is too easily enamored of pleasure. That what is pleasant and what is good do not necessarily coincide comes to him seemingly as a new insight. For instance, upon tasting a Paralandrian fruit described as of yellow color and with a firm rind, he experiences sheer ecstasy. It was, the book reads, like the discovery of a totally new genus of pleasures, something unheard of among men, out of all reckoning, beyond all covenant. As he let the empty gourd fall from his hand and was about to pluck a second one, it came into his head that he was now neither hungry nor thirsty. And yet, to repeat a pleasure so intense and spiritual seemed an obvious thing to do. His reason, or what we commonly take to be reason in our own world, was all in favor of tasting this miracle again. Yet something seemed to oppose this reason. It is difficult to suppose that this opposition came from desire. For what desire would turn away from so much deliciousness? But for whatever cause, it appeared to him better not to taste again. Perhaps the experience had been so complete that repetition would be a vulgarity, like asking to hear the same symphony twice in a day. Later, he stumbles through a grove of what he comes to call bubble trees, full of shimmering globes, the bursting of which filled his nostrils with a sharp, shrill, exquisite sense, and to his eyes made all the colors about him seem richer. Again, quoting the text, looking at a fine cluster of the bubbles which hung above his head, he thought how easy it would be to get up and plunge oneself through the whole lot of them and to feel all at once that magical refreshment multiplied tenfold. But he was restrained by the same sort of feeling which had restrained him overnight from tasting a second gourd. This itch to have things all over again, was it possibly the root of all evil? No. Of course, the love of money was called that. But money itself, perhaps one valued it chiefly as a defense against chance, a security for being able to have things over again. Repeatedly, Ransom catches himself upon the verge of sinfully seizing and enjoying inordinate pleasure in Paralandra's goods. Yet guided by the morally well-ordered ways of the Green Lady, Queen Tenedril, Ransom does, in fact, come to enjoy aright Paralandrian pleasures. He decidedly does not retreat into ascetic self-denial, as if beating the desire for pleasure out of himself would simultaneously beat the hell out of himself as well. Although pleasure and the good are not coextensive, neither is it the case that pleasure and wickedness coincide. It depends. The pleasures of a virtuous person are good. The vicious person's pleasure is wicked. Degree of pleasure has little to do with the distinction. Far more important are the kind of pleasure that one enjoys and the purposes of the will in seeking pleasure. Consider 4 distinct features of Queen Tenedril's pleasures upon Paralandra. First, she inhabits a world of divinely superintended gifts. Second, she receives such gifts with gratitude. Third, she finds her pleasure compounded in sharing rather than in hoarding. And fourth, the goods in which she delights are sacramentally significant moments of communion with Maladil. Therefore, it is right and proper for Queen Tenedril to abide by the counsel Virgil gives Dante 2/3 of the way through the Divine Comedy. Let pleasure be your guide. By contrast, we elsewhere witness Weston, the demonic antagonist and would-be spoiler of Paralandra, enjoying pleasures conceived under a diabolically formed counter-imagination. What those vicious pleasures are, and with what results, I won't speak of here. Paralandra then beautifully explores the prelapsarian possibilities of an Edenic paradise full of pleasure. It makes clear the tragedy of humanity's fall. It dramatically reveals the relationship between pleasure and virtue and intellect and will. And in an American culture characterized by the incessant disordered desire for more and more, in a consumer-driven world in which we are driven to acquire as much as possible irrespective of need or satisfaction of desire, Lewis's novel provides a telling critique. Better than that, though, he does not merely tell us off as a mere scold might, but he traces an alternative narrative we might inhabit, both to our good and others. For on Venus, Ransom knows the pleasure of virtuous eros, such as it only can be when it is made subordinate to caritas. With Boethius, one of Lewis's guiding lights, he seems to pray, "O happy race of men, if love who rules the sky could rule your hearts as well."
The third volume of Lewis's space trilogy is, of course, That Hideous Strength, which we've been talking about a bit here. This volume is set entirely on Earth, and unlike the first 2 volumes, there is no space travel, enchanting interplanetary vegetable and animal life ruled by intriguing new laws of physics, biology, and geology. It doesn't even seem like what most of us want to call science fiction. In the first 100 pages, we're not sure what the genre might be. It might be a romance, a conspiracy thriller, a murder mystery, perhaps even an academic comedy. If we've read the first 2 volumes of the space trilogy, we might initially have trouble seeing how this third volume fits into, let alone culminates, the trilogy. We don't even meet the mysterious director of St. Anne's until we're more than a third of the way into the book, and we won't know for sure that it's Professor Ransom until the midway point, though there are knowing hints. By the time we get to the end, these questions are certainly resolved, even if only through Lewis's introduction of even more challenging and provocative proposals. In the very few minutes that I have, I want to say a few words about Lewis's presentation of higher education and the delusions and dangers to which we academics are prone. Perhaps we shouldn't be so surprised that Lewis moves from questions about original sin and the fall in Paralandra so quickly to university life. As David already said, the more things change, the more they stay the same. The setting for that hideous strength is Bracton College in the tiny but beautiful city of Edgestoke. Braxton is small but prestigious. It takes no undergraduates. It has only 40 fellows or faculty members. The college owns the property of Bragdon Wood, an ancient, mysterious enclosed forest within which great dramas from the Anglo-Saxon period occurred, and Merlin was rumored to have been buried some 1,500 years prior. Bragdon Wood is enclosed with a high wall and has severely restricted access. It is the college's prized possession. At the beginning of the narrative, we are shocked to discover that the progressive element of the university is secretly angling to sell a portion of the wood to the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments, or the NICE. The NICE will create a new research headquarters with buildings to rival the skyline of New York in what was once Merlin's ancient forest. Quote, "The NICE was the first fruits of that constructive fusion between the state and the laboratory on which so many thoughtful people base their hopes for a better world," end quote. One of the first things we recognize is the Machiavellian machinations which the progressive element seeks to outflank, its traditionalist opponents. The faculty meeting at which they vote to sell their pearl of great price would be hilarious if it didn't strike a chord so close to home. A series of orchestrated crises, unplanned maintenance expenses, funding of junior stipends, fear that if Bracton turns down the NICE, it will go to Cambridge and ruin Bracton's rankings. Okay, he didn't use the word rankings, but you get the idea. Lead a majority of the fellows to agree to selling almost the whole of the wood to the NICE. The tyranny of the urgent once again paves the way for doing what would have been unthinkable only a short time before. The fellows embrace their own destruction without ever realizing what they have so willingly given up. As Lord Feverstone, divine, acknowledges about the Braxton fellows, quote, "Though they can be persuaded to take the right train, or even drive it, they haven't a ghost of a notion where it's going or why." The real goal of the NICE is, quote, "to take over the human race and recondition it, make man a really efficient animal," end quote. Or as another puts it, quote, "The NICE marks the beginning of a new era, the really scientific era," unquote. Most of us want to be where the action is. We want to be in on the latest research. We covet the admiration of our colleagues, and we want to be a part of the inner ring. This last desire animates Mark Studdock's actions more than any other. What is the inner ring? It is that privileged subgroup of movers and shakers within any organization. When Mark first realizes that he is on the inside and now a part of the we, the word becomes sweet in his mouth. Closely connected with the longing desire for membership in the inner ring is the contempt which the elites have for those outside of it. The recalcitrant academics who are not part of the progressive element of the college are the obscurantists and, quote, "the wrong sort of scientists," unquote. Their opinions are mere obstacles to be outmaneuvered. Even more damning is the explicit acknowledgement by the leaders of the NICE that all rural citizens, agricultural laborers, and small shopkeepers can simply be eliminated to serve the greater good proposed by NICE. Under the guise of compassion, the NICE will take over prisons and abolish punishment in favor of rehabilitation and research. That Hideous Strength was published in 1945. Alan and David were talking about this a moment ago. What should be obvious, of course, is that this volume is written during the final years of World War II, a period of time in which the world has seen capitulation and collaboration, and both of these words are used explicitly, by leading scholars with notorious powers of state leading to disastrous results. It should not be lost on us that Lewis has the courage to suggest that what happened across the channel could very well happen within the blessed plot. This is the point that Ransom understands and attempts to communicate to Jane. Certain avenues of action are simply closed off to the members of the manor at St. Anne's who are opposing the nice. Ransom says, quote, "Otherwise we become just like our enemies, breaking all the rules whenever we imagine that we might possibly do some vague good to humanity in the remote future." End quote. Mark starts off believing that, in addition to securing his future and his prestige, the Institute will accomplish something noble, or at least perhaps something nice. Abolishing punishment is bound to be good, yes? But herein lie the dangers of our delusions. What does nice have in mind? Featherstone confesses, quote, "Quite simple and obvious things at first. Sterilization of the unfit, liquidation of backward races, we don't want any dead weights, selective breeding. It'll have to be psychological at first, but we'll get on to biochemical conditioning in the end and direct manipulation of the brain." End quote. And then to close the cell with Mark, he says, "It's the real thing at last, a new type of man, and it's people like you who've got to begin to make him." The grotesque police chief Hardcastle offers Mark both the carrot and the stick. "You haven't yet realized what you're in on. You're being offered a chance at something far bigger than a seat in the cabinet. And there are only two alternatives, you know, either to be in the nice or to be out of it." It takes Mark an embarrassingly long time to realize what a fix he's gotten himself into, and without the intervention of Ransom and even Merlin, for crying out loud, Mark very nearly doesn't get out alive. In the end, he loses his position, his college, but he saves his life, and he regains his wife. One does not have to accept Lewis's fantastic Cytherean and jovial conclusion to see that as higher education becomes ever more utilitarian in its outlook and beholden to our own nice institutes and sources of funding, that hideous strength continues to offer a cautionary tale to all of us. Thank you. So, Trent, I think you said just open the floor up for any kind of questions, or?
Yeah.
All right.
So, do you have a theory about how that hideous strength is culmination or tying together of the rest of the trilogy? Because it really does stand out, not just on the shelf. It stands out as 3 times as thick as either of the other two. It's just a completely different feeling kind of story. It took me, when I first tried to read it, I called it that hideous book because I just could not get through that first third on the first 3 tries. And now it might be, alternately one of my favorites. What's going on there?
Well, I think if the first 2/3 are a little bit different, the last third certainly brings all these things together, because we then begin to see the connection both to Mars and to Venus and to the experience that Ransom had there, and how unknown to the Satan figure and to the demonic element to invite these angels or other spirits in to address these concerns. I mean, this all comes to the culmination at the end. I don't really want to spoil it for anybody that, maybe I've already spoiled it, but if you haven't read it, I mean, that the threads come together in a really fantastic way in that last third of the hideous
Yeah, I
strength.
mean, the plot lines come together, but I'm thinking thematically, it's almost like, tell me if this is a fair comparison. When you read The Hobbit, you can come away thinking, I just read a really great, rollicking good story. Things get serious in Lord of the Rings in a way that distinguishes the trilogy from The Hobbit. Things are really, you feel like the world is more in peril. And I feel like that hideous strength differs from the previous 2 books in that way, that maybe in the telling of the story, Lewis realized it had more weighty, more serious consequences than he envisioned when he was writing the first two books.
Trent, if I can venture a brief answer at, well, on behalf of the conclusion that there's a greater unity of purpose in the third volume than you just intimated, it would consist in this. The first book, Transpiring in the Realm of Mars, is a book that explores, among other things, the difficulties of conquest and the necessity of formation and courage of the right sort. Paralandra, as I was describing a moment ago, is about eros, about pleasure, about love. As Ralph Wood earlier described, we've got also the exploration of masculinity and femininity, truly and well understood in each of those. It seems to me in the third that we've got both of these strands coming together with the hope of a resolution in the messiness and ugliness of earthly life, most of all within the context of the university, where both Mark's poorly formed masculinity and ineptitude to express a correct courage in the face of what amounts to a conquest, a war of conquest by nice, is, on the other hand, met with by Jane's inability to understand the femininity which is properly hers. She's incapable of taking pleasure in what it means to be a woman, a married woman. And both of these things, over the course of the novel, come to a head with a resolution which I won't spoil, as Dr. Moore didn't spoil. But it seems to me that that's the burden of the third novel. It is a hideously long book, and it's difficult to get into. I don't know all the reasons for that, although my surmise would actually be that the first 100 pages or so are so drab and dreary and difficult by design. This is a very charitable reading of Lewis, precisely because the demonic has so impoverished the world that Lewis is describing. And it can't possibly be a world of fecundity and beauty and loveliness when it's overshadowed by the likes of the demonic characters of nice. Dreariness, drabness, darkness, dullness are precisely the character of the demonic. But whether or not we need quite so much of it, I think I would question that.
I just thought that was university life.
One more way to think about the unity of these, and there's no question of the difference of these novels, even Out of the Silent Planet and Paralandra are quite different in style and in narrative. But it's in the title of the first novel, Out of the Silent Planet. Tulkandra Earth is the silent planet, and as you recall, I will give away the ending. My colleagues won't, but I will give away the ending. It's an invasion of Earth. It's an invasion of, there has been no communication from the silent planet. The silent planet has gone, there's no communication out, and the silent planet is also apparently deaf to the to this richer form of communication that Ransom discovers on Malacandra and Paralandra. This is a reclamation of
I don't
that.
think that counts as spoiling it.
I didn't spoil
I was
it.
talking about the elephants.
The actual ending nobody could ever foresee. That comes out of nowhere.
David.
I wonder if each one of you might have a different opinion on this, but how the theme of recovering history, right, seeing it properly plays out in each of the three novels. Right, so recovering history, coming rightly to see what the history is, and also a new way of thinking about history. So you have Ransom's assumptions about what's happened on Malacandra in the first, the vision of the relapsarian possibilities of Maryland, and then the third, all that crazy business with Merlin. And even at the end of Out of the Silent Planet, him recognizing in the damn difficult Latin of the 16th century, I can't remember exactly how he puts it, that he's starting to see through history, even in Earth's death history, little hints of the truth that he's now discovered on his voyage outside. So with the history of Merlin, the relapsarian, and the history of Malacandra and Earth's relationship, I wonder if each of you might have an opinion on the role of history through this novel as well.
The technical answer here, David, would have to be beats me. You know, I mean, that's a compelling, interesting way that you've presented it there. I mean, I haven't thought about that, and would need to take some time to think about it. I mean, that's an interesting way to go at it. Yeah. Sorry. You got anything better?
Very briefly, all Weston can see, the villain of the first novel, all Weston, or the three novels really, all Weston can see is the future. So I think there's an important dialectic there of Weston's exclusive look at what is coming, and Ransom and the Studdocks learning of what's past and the treasure there.
Absolute faith that whatever the future is will be better. But his incoherent answer to what Yar said and all that stuff, whatever it is better, it's going to be good because it is the future.
One thing that I'll add, and I think it's a question, as Scott said, that merits more consideration, but Ransom obviously is possessed of a wide panoply of understanding of the past that crops up in a variety of ways over the course of the novels, taking on a new significance that had never previously occurred to him, such that the meaning of history he understands, as all history has to be understood retrospectively. So there's a kind of ridiculous claim that I could be accused of making here. But it's a retrospective history that grows, that takes on new proportions after he has seen what it looks like from a wider point of view, right? An unearthly point of view. And I think there is something quite important about that. It's not, though, the view from nowhere that Dr. Wood was excoriating earlier. It's a particular view. It's just from another position, right, another planet. So that if we are to be well-formed within our own tradition, we've got to wrestle seriously with the past, but not supposing in a prearranged or Procrustean sort of way that it's going to fit neatly to whatever pattern we already have figured out, right? It may be that we are stunned to find out something we thought was incredibly important in history, in fact, is incidental, and something quite remarkably small and passed over is the hinge on which cosmic history, in fact, turns.
So, one of the things that stands out in the third book is the role of gender and possibly sex in the sense of male and female, and gender is something broader than sex, biological sex. Lewis has been both praised and criticized for his use of sex and gender in That Hideous Strength. And I wonder if each of you could just say a word about that. About his use of gender and sex, about whether you think he's tied. I mean, some people say, excoriate him for being stuck in the past and essentializing sex and gender and emphasizing stereotypes and such. Others have praised him for actually being very progressive in those passages. And so I wonder whether you think the people who see him as fairly progressive are more approximately correct, or those who see him as more of a dinosaur reinforcing false stereotypes are more correct, or whether you think he strikes some interesting balance.
Yeah, the question from Trent is about sort of questions of gender and sexuality, and the theme of gender and sexuality and the nature of marriage is a theme that runs throughout the whole of, I think in some substantial ways throughout the whole of all three books, but especially the second and the third book. And Trent's exactly right. Lewis has received a lot of criticism for how these things are treated. This character, Jane, is a graduate student who is a kind of liberated woman or struggling to be a liberated woman in some sense. And there is a very poor marriage between Jane and Mark, and some of it is found in a way in which they have no engagement in their marriage, either emotionally or intellectually or sexually, and it's very utilitarian in all the way around. And so my own sense here, Trent, is that Lewis is very good in the critique of the kind of ways in which modern marriage seems to understand itself mostly about security and personal fulfillment, and then is surprised when there's neither security nor personal fulfillment, because the marriage is created in such a way that it's so exclusively focused on meeting one's own needs. So I think that the critique that Lewis offers here is something that I'm very congenial to. I'm not terribly persuaded about the solution that he offers. But I do think that that solution has to be understood from the very first page. He says that it's a fairy tale, and so there is a kind of fairy tale character to this, but it's quite easy to see how people could get upset about this. But I think the ending is just so fantastic, and by that I mean literally sort of fantasy-filled, that it's hard to take it too seriously as a kind of proposal for how to solve the problems of modern marriage. I mean, this is not really a solution to all of these kinds of matters. So I'm more inclined to listen to the critique, but not be too bothered or enthusiastic about the solutions that Lewis comes up with.
I think for Lewis, the solution there is quite serious for Lewis. I don't,
Yeah.
how seriously we take it is of course a different matter. But what we tend to, and Lewis I think is responding to the modern tendency to see gender and sex in clinical, political, and psychological terms, or perhaps economic terms exclusively. And what he does in That Hideous Strength is to reclaim this ritual, mystical understanding of gender and sex. So through liturgy, through pageantry, through whatever sort of ritual however you see that ending, it's a very ritualistic ending to reclaim a different way that we've forgotten to see marriage. Marriage, in particular, as a window on, the ritual marriage as a window onto gender and sex. I think that's very serious to Lewis. And so, while it's very foreign to us, I think that he saw it as what he would call a true
and I'm
myth.
more sympathetic with the formal rather than material, right? I mean, that there are a number of categories here that we should be thinking about with regard, but without the assumption that it involves these sort of goofy robes and all this kind of stuff,
Did you say this a little bit louder, without the assumption that it involves?
Yeah, without sort of the particularities. I mean, there is a kind of pageantry that's involved here, and I think that's not. I mean, it's something Lewis probably did take seriously, but we should think of it more formally than materially.
I think the crux, though, is not in all of those things, as important as they are, but in the recapitulation within marriage of husband and wife of the relationship between Christ and the church. And though the evidence in the novel is not deep for that view, in fact, there is an exchange between Ransom and Jane in which he says that in relation to Maladril, we are all feminine. We all receive a superabundance and do so gladly and joyfully. And this fits in, albeit with a very traditional understanding of gender, but I think that Lewis would want to say it's grounded in the revelation of Scripture itself, and that that's the very most important element that the novel is trying to give expression to. And part of the point is, for himself, that there is no masculinity by the man that can be trumped or trumpeted over the femininity of women. there is room for us to participate and to receive graciously a role appropriate to our condition as it relates to the divine itself.
All right, well, thank you so much for that great panel